We'll just give it a minute for everyone to log in. Perhaps one more minute just to ensure there's no technical difficulties with others logging in, and then we'll get started. Okay, so in the interest of time, we're going to kick off. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are excited to have the opportunity to speak with all of you. My name is Jennifer Miniota. I lead our client and partnership success team, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kamran Khan. Dr. Khan is an infectious disease physician at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, a professor of medicine at the University of Toronto, and the founder and CEO of Bluedot. After training at Cornell, Columbia, and Harvard, Dr. Khan began his career in Toronto just as SARS crippled the city. He spent the last 18 years researching and developing the global early warning system for infectious diseases that became what we now know as Bluedot. Dr. Khan has published widely in top journals, advised the world's top public health organizations, and won Canada's Governor General Award for Innovation. Dr. Khan will field your questions after his talk, so please go ahead and type them in the Q&A section as they arise. Now, without further delay, I will turn it over to Dr. Khan.
Thank you, Jennifer. Really appreciate that kind introduction. And I'm just going to share my screen here. So hopefully you can see my slides, maybe just a signal if you can see them. I'll take that as a yes. Okay, I got a thumbs up. So thank you very much, Jen, and thank you to everyone who has taken the time out of your afternoon to join this call. I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so talking a bit about how we got ourselves into the COVID-19 pandemic, how the world is going to get itself out of this pandemic, and ultimately, what do we need to do to prevent ourselves from getting into the same type of situation again in the future. So I'm going to start out just with an image here that goes back to the fact that in the last year and almost a year and a half, we have been living through a pretty remarkable period where a virus that you can fit thousands of them on the head of a pin has really crippled the entire planet. And this is something that we haven't really experienced in modern times. But this didn't come out of nowhere. Just 3 years earlier, the world was in the midst of a public health emergency that was declared to be a global emergency by the World Health Organization, where a virus spread by mosquitoes was causing severe birth defects in young children, something we had never seen before. And of course, this was a Zika epidemic that really crippled Latin America and had implications across the globe. Now, a year earlier, in 2015, Seoul in South Korea experienced an outbreak from another novel coronavirus called MERS, or the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus. Now, this image used to shock people. When people saw this image of a wedding, which is an incredibly social event, and people wearing masks, the contrast just seemed to be incredibly striking. But here we are today, and this type of image doesn't really shock us anymore. And it really begins to show how infectious diseases have started to impact our very way of life. Now, the year before that, in 2014, you may recall the world was going through, in particular in West Africa, the worst outbreak of Ebola in recorded history. And it's something that absolutely caused terror across the entire planet. Now, thankfully, that outbreak was brought to a close, but not before there were over 10,000 deaths. And there are remnants of that outbreak that continue to simmer and appear from time to time. And in 2009, so this is just 10 years before COVID-19, which was named after the year that it emerged in 2019, we were in another pandemic, the H1N1 influenza pandemic. Now, not as severe as what we're going through, but make no mistake, we were in the midst of a pandemic only 10 years ago. So keeping that in mind, between 2009 and 2019, we had 2 pandemics and 4 other global public health emergencies as declared by the World Health Organization. And it was only 6 years before that, as Jen had mentioned, I was just beginning my career as an infectious disease physician when the first novel coronavirus outbreak, SARS, appeared in Toronto and really crippled our city, our healthcare system, overwhelmed our public health system, and really had massive economic implications. So we were in Toronto experiencing what the world is going through with COVID, but really just at a city level. So this was for me really a recognition that we need to move faster and smarter than we've ever moved before. And so for the last 18 years, I've been working as an academic to develop the foundation for better mechanisms to detect, assess, and respond to infectious disease threats. In 2013, I founded Bluedot, and we've been building this global epidemic intelligence platform that has 3 of those key pillars that I'm going to talk about. The first is to be able to detect infectious disease threats faster and more comprehensively than we've ever been able to do before. The second is to rapidly assess what risks do these events present? Are they likely to spread locally, globally? And if they do, what is the potential impact of their dispersion? And finally, how do we turn all of that deep science and mathematics and modeling into something that's actionable and meaningful for our clients so they understand what does it mean and what are the appropriate actions I need to take in order to prevent or at least mitigate that risk? Now, this is not a simple endeavor, as you can imagine. We're dealing with hundreds of different types of diseases appearing anywhere in the world at any moment in time. And we have to be able to move along this continuum quickly, from detect to assess to respond very rapidly, because if we've learned anything from COVID-19, it is that outbreaks spread fast. And if we want to be in front of them, we're going to have to move even faster. Now, I wanted to just describe these 3 pillars briefly at a high level in terms of the work we're doing at Bluedot. In the first pillar on detect, we have been gathering and organizing data on the most comprehensive and most up-to-date infectious disease surveillance data from across the globe, not only through official sources reported by government agencies, but also unofficial sources. And it was this system that was using machine learning and AI that actually picked up this early signal of an unusual cluster of pneumonia cases in Wuhan back in late December of 2019, translated it, flagged it for us, and presented it to our team of subject matter experts. Now, that certainly caught our attention, but our system is also looking at not just what's happening, but what is its potential for dispersion. Now, the world, as we know, is maybe not right at this very moment, but is an incredibly mobile community of billions of people. And humans inadvertently are moving infectious diseases around the planet. Now, we also know that where we are roughly today is most of the world is actually also carrying things like smartphones with them that are connecting to the internet. Now, we have been working with, and I want to highlight and underscore, anonymized data, operating entirely anonymously and adhering to all privacy laws and regulations to make use of these data so we can better anticipate how these types of outbreaks might spread. Now, we're doing this at a local level. We're here. That blue pin is in fact actually the location of the market right around in the center of Wuhan, where the cases of initially COVID-19 were being reported. These circles are airports. And without getting into the details of how we do all of this work, this system is assessing how populations are moving from the epicenter of an outbreak, where they may be going locally, and including what types of airports they may be traveling to. Now, if we take a step back and look at this even at a regional level, this is some work we were doing right at the very beginning of the pandemic. Now, these are mobile devices that were first in Wuhan, which we followed for the next 14 days to anticipate where this disease might actually be moving to. And what we found are there were significant numbers of devices appearing in Tokyo, in Seoul, in Shanghai, in Taipei, Hong Kong, and in Bangkok. And it actually turns out that these were, in fact, the very first cities that were impacted by COVID-19. Now, as I mentioned, our analytics are connecting not just the movements of populations by ground travel or train or bus or other conveyance, but also connecting that information instantaneously in terms of where there's an outbreak to the locations of neighboring commercial airports, so we can assess the possible long arc trajectories of the outbreak to distant parts of the world. Now, this is a snapshot image of what our system produced in about 2 seconds on the morning of December 31st, looking at the flight paths with nonstop flights around the world. And the circles there represent the volumes of travelers whose final destinations were in those locations. Now, I do want to point out, as soon as we saw this and had some concerns about what was appearing in Wuhan, we published the world's first peer-reviewed scientific study on COVID-19 in early January, which accurately picked up many of these first cities that were impacted by COVID-19. At the top of our list was Bangkok. Bangkok was, in fact, the very first city in the world that reported cases of COVID-19 as it appeared outside of mainland China. Now, I do want to highlight, we're not just doing this for COVID-19, we're doing this in an automated way for any outbreak appearing anywhere in the world at any given moment in time. Now, I do want to highlight the disease is spread around the world all the time. I see patients with malaria who come in from different parts of the world, but they don't catalyze malaria outbreaks here in our backyard, nor do they catalyze pandemics in most situations. But when we think about these sort of metaphorical embers, when you have an outbreak, it's a bit like a fire with embers flying off. And those embers, in some situations, can land on dry brush and then lead to another outbreak or another fire. In other situations, they land on concrete and fizzle out. Now, this is a very important and active area of work at Bluedot, which is thinking about every single pathogen, how it interacts with populations across the planet, and what are the environmental conditions. And it is the nexus of these different factors that really help determine whether or not a geographic area anywhere in the world at any moment in time may be susceptible to an outbreak. And so this is really for us to go beyond just simply dispersion of pathogens, so we can anticipate what the disruption is, what is the actual outbreak that may occur in these destinations. As you can imagine, this is an incredibly complex area of work because every pathogen has its own unique signature. A disease that's spread through mosquitoes like Zika, we need to understand where mosquitoes are. We need to understand climate conditions, demographics, housing conditions, and so forth. Or if we're talking about measles, we need to know about things like vaccine uptake and a whole bunch of other factors. So this is a very, very challenging but important area of work where we are using our deep expertise in the subject matter, in automation with engineering and machine learning and so forth. Now, how did this whole system work in the pandemic life cycle? Now, this is a very simplified curve. Of course, we know the world has been going through multiple different waves, but just to give a sense of how our underlying platform worked in the initial stages of the pandemic with early detection and recognition that this was appearing in Wuhan, again, with the idea that we have as much lead time as possible. And the second piece has been to anticipate the spread and importation. So for example, one of our clients in Taiwan CDC, was using our data and our analytics to make early decisions right out of the gates about what types of measures they wanted to be taking at their ports of entry to prevent or at least mitigate the risk of importation. Now, as COVID-19 appeared and made landfall in different parts of the world, for example, let's say in the state of California, which issued the first stay-at-home orders in North America, we were there using some of our mobile data analytics to help support the public health response. Were social distancing measures and stay-at-home orders, were they working? Were there certain neighborhoods perhaps where the populations were unable to actually limit their mobility because they had to go to work, as well as doing things like forecasting infectious disease and COVID-19 activity, even down to the level of counties across the entire US. Now, as we look forward, this is not the case for the entire world at this moment in time, but for some parts of the world, particularly in Canada, the US, and other industrialized countries, we're now starting to think about how do we, begin to reopen safely? How do we think about what parts of the world are actually achieving some stability as it relates to COVID-19 activity? And how might we start to reopen travel and trade and commerce and other types of corridors, but do it in a way that isn't putting the country itself at risk? And we're just starting to see now more mind share and more attention being focused to, let's get out of this pandemic, but also we better start thinking now about how do we build resilience and readiness for the next set of threats. We haven't been able to focus a lot of time and energy on it in the middle of this crisis, but we need to start thinking about that right now. So I just wanted to share briefly a little bit about some of the work Bluedot is doing on helping many of our clients think about reopening and safely. And so we have a reopening tracker that is currently available to our clients. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the key dimensions of how we decide whether or not countries around the world are really ready for reopening, and in particular, whether they are stable, whether we can anticipate that COVID-19 transmission is really going to start to diminish and ideally stay at low levels. Part of that is we are mapping out the populations that are at high risk of consequences from COVID-19 to see that at least 80% of those populations have received at least one dose of a vaccine. We're also looking at overall immunity in the population, and not only immunity from actual natural infections and estimates of natural infections in the population, but also from vaccinated immunity as well. And reaching a threshold of about 65%. And that is just a ballpark figure of what we might think of as a herd immunity threshold. The reality is we don't, no one knows exactly what the precise herd immunity threshold here is, but this is a pretty good estimate. And then the third dimension is ultimately, what are we seeing in terms of COVID-19 activity? There are certain instances where vaccination uptake is being reported to be high, but we're starting to see COVID-19 cases go up high. And sometimes it may have to do with the vaccine that's being utilized. There may be other circumstances. So these are kind of the safety checks for us to be able to look across each country and see, are they reaching a place of stability? Now, I want to just say a few words about the outlook of the pandemic and how, we're thinking about it here at Bluedot. I'm just going to start out by saying that COVID-19 is really, it's on a path that every pandemic goes through. It has a beginning, has a middle, and it has an end. And the pandemic certainly started out with outbreaks that are occurring widely across the entire planet. But as we move forward, we are going to start to see outbreaks appearing in certain parts of the world, and they're going to become increasingly localized and sporadic in different places. But ultimately, where the world is headed is COVID-19 is not going away. This is here to stay. But it's ultimately going to become what we call an endemic disease, which is there will just likely be low level of transmission or activity occurring in the general population. There are 4 other coronaviruses that cause the cold. COVID-19 is probably going to move more and more toward that. It's still going to take some time, but that's really ultimately where this virus is headed. Now, vaccines are helping us accelerate the transition from pandemic to local epidemics to endemic. And in particular, industrialized countries are moving along that particular path more quickly than we are seeing in the developing world. And this is a real challenge and a real problem for the world, because we know that with RNA viruses like coronaviruses or influenza viruses, is that they tend to go through mutations as they replicate their genome. They're sloppy in terms of their spell checks, if you will, and they create these variants that help the virus evade the host immune response. But this, of course, creates a challenge for the rest of the world, because these variants might be either more communicable, they may be more dangerous in terms of the health impacts they may have, or they may actually evade the immune response that we have developed from our existing vaccines. And of course, it's those variants and the possibility, we don't know for sure just how long immunity lasts with our existing vaccine, that if immunity is to wane over time, we may find ourselves with reinfections starting to occur. And we have seen these to some degree. But what is very likely in that situation is reinfections are far more likely to be milder, more attenuated illnesses than the severe kinds of illnesses we've seen at the beginning of the pandemic. So COVID-19 is not going away, but it's not going to be the same COVID-19 that we saw at the beginning of the pandemic. And so some of the key points I really want to just make here is this notion of herd immunity is a bit of a moving target because of variants, because of this uncertainty about immunity and how long it's sustained. And so this is something we're going to obviously need to be watching very carefully as COVID-19 has this very long tail. It's not going to just turn off, but it's going to kind of linger on for some time, and certainly will be much longer in the developing world. So I'm going to end here with this very famous aphorism from the Spanish philosopher George Santayana. I think it's important for us to think about this at this moment. You know, those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. We all desperately want to get out of this pandemic. I am certain that none of us want to find ourselves in the next one anytime soon. And so, you know, we have been building for 7 years solutions that are there to offer our clients a continual state of readiness of what's happening in the world, not just with COVID-19, with over 100 different pathogens appearing around the globe. How likely are they to spread, where and when, and what are the potential impacts and consequences? And so we've already developed a variety of solutions, both software and data services, where we can channel all of these insights to our clients, because ultimately our belief is that we're going to have to move faster and smarter, and we're going to need to use data and analytics and technology to help us get there. Now, I'm going to end here with you know, this slide, which is really about the fact that at Bluedot we're turning data to insights, but in order to get from insight or actionable insight to action, we need to do this with our clients. And we have had the privilege of doing this with public health agencies at a local level or municipal level, like the city of Toronto, the city of Chicago, at the provincial or state level, like the state of California, the province of Ontario, or even the national level in terms of, you know, the Taiwan CDC, the Ministry of Health in Singapore, the Government of Canada, as well as supranational agencies like the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. But this is not just a challenge for public health. This is also a challenge for the whole of government and really the whole of society. We've had the privilege of working with organizations like the Department of National Defense, with NATO, because we do know that defense has played in the past, and certainly even in COVID-19, an important role in helping the response to a crisis or an outbreak that may be spiraling out of control. We've had the privilege of working with the security community, such as Global Affairs Canada, including supporting efforts with organizations like Interpol, because not all of these threats that we will see in the future will come from Mother Nature. Some of them may in fact come from deliberate acts, and we've seen that in the past. In 2001, anthrax was weaponized and sent through the US postal system. And lastly, I will say that we've had the pleasure of working with a number of private sector organizations, airlines, airports, and large multinational corporations to help them be able to think about resilience in their organization, protecting the organization against impacts to business continuity, supply chains, protecting their employees around the world, their customers. And ultimately, this has been an incredible opportunity for us to learn together and to build this type of resilience together that ultimately we all need, not only for our own interests, but ultimately to contribute to a safer, a healthier, and a more secure world. So thank you very much again for joining this afternoon. I think I will turn it back to Jen for any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khan, for the insightful presentation. So we'll now transition to the question and answer period. We have about 4 minutes left. I'm going to start off with a few questions we received in advance over email. And for those of you who have questions, if we do not get to them today, please feel free to reach out to us directly. So Kamran, one of the first questions we have is, how do your clients know what to do with the data and insights that they are generating?
Okay, thank you for that question. It's a really important one, and I'll try and keep my remarks fairly short here and brief. But again, as Jen said, please do reach out. We would love to have this conversation. In fact, my response really speaks to that. In many instances, our clients are not subject matter experts in infectious diseases or in epidemiology. And it's ultimately an opportunity for us to learn with our clients about how do they make decisions within their organizations, or how can we support them with turning these insights into actions? How can they be integrated into existing decision-making processes or routines? And if they don't exist, how can we help support the organization to think through what those processes should look like? So I would really describe this as a co-discovery opportunity. And it's really one that I think is incredibly important and necessary if we're going to get from our ability to detect and assess the risks of infectious disease threats, but then ultimately move beyond to ultimately responding to those threats. And so it's really, in some ways, I would welcome the opportunity to really learn from so many of you. We have learned that this is not a problem just for public health or for government. It's really a whole of society problem. But we can play to our strengths in turning data into insights, and we would love to work with you in turning those insights into action that benefit your organization and really the world around us.
Great, thank you. And another question we have is, how does Bluedot detect outbreaks in countries where information may be suppressed?
Okay, again, an excellent question. What I would say is, first of all, when it comes to infectious disease surveillance, historically, what we've generally relied upon is official reports about what are called notifiable diseases. It's a list of diseases that are considered to be important from a public health perspective, and there's a defined list. But often that information is not reported in a timely manner. There may be significant delays before we actually understand what's happening in a population, which has led us to start using things like machine learning and AI to actually expand our global view of infectious disease risk, as I was describing, and gathering and organizing all of this information in different languages. Now, the person asking this question is correct. There are certain places in the world where it's harder to gather that information, but this is where we have a continuous process of digging deeper and deeper in our surveillance efforts to use informal sources of data online, the blogs, the world's online media, in all these different languages to gather this type of information. So it's not to say that there will be always perfect visibility on every infectious disease risk, but we are continuously decreasing the number of blind spots that we have by advancing our surveillance capabilities, not only with our subject matter experts on our team, but our data engineers and our data scientists.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khan. So we are approaching 4:30 in Eastern Standard Time, and we'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. And thank you again, Dr. Khan, for the presentation and your insights. If any attendees have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out, and we are happy to answer those offline. We hope everyone has a fantastic day, and looking forward to connecting soon.
Thank you, everyone.